Welcome back to another edition of Revolution Recap. We're coming back to you after the Revolution blew a 3-1 halftime lead against Orlando City on a road trip in Orlando. What was really a pretty big game for the Revolution, as Orlando is one of the teams that's been trying to catch them for that seventh and final playoff spot. The Revolution got off to a good start in this one with kind of a fortuitous own goal. Gustavo Bou did a good play on the left wing, but was a bit lucky that Akindele had kind of a acrobatic redirect into his own net. Then the Revolution gave up that lead on a nanny header off of a corner kick, which was kind of disappointing marking from the Revolution. But they came back through Christian Pinilla to take the lead again in the 35th minute on a fantastic chip from Pinilla, and then Gustavo Bou doubled the Revolution lead, made it 3-1 in the 41st minute on another nice finish after some nice combination play from Carles Heel. But coming into the second half, the Revolution got off to a terrible start, looked really flat-footed. Just the 47th minute, Dom Dwyer made it 3-2, and then Nani made it 3-3 in the 54th minute, and really Orlando had some chances to even take the lead after that. The Revolution late in the game had a chance to get it back themselves, but overall kind of a disappointing result for the Revolution given they were up 3-1. Joining me today is Seth Macomber from the Bent Musket. Seth, how are you doing?
Good. I'm happy to be here. I mean, as you can tell by how long it took you to go through all the goals there, it was a pretty wild game last night.
So what do you make of that game? Was this really a case of 2 points dropped for the Revolution given how well they started?
Yeah, totally. I mean, to be up 3-1 at halftime is something you hope to hold on to. That said, it's kind of an interesting one because you come back from the break and Dom Dwyer scores that goal. And to me, the Revs really don't do anything wrong in that play. I mean, it looks like everything is well covered. Up until that moment, they were playing very compact. It was difficult for Orlando to try to break through it all. And right before that play, you actually saw Orlando go all the way back to their back line before restarting and coming at them again. So it seemed like the Revs had the idea to go into this break and then come out of it and really try to play compact soccer and make sure that they don't allow Orlando back into the game. But then, that wonderful header from Dwyer gives them an opportunity to get back in the game. The fans get really rowdy. It's a wet, wild atmosphere. So, I mean, that to me was a defining moment, and I'm not sure how unavoidable it was. I'm going to have an article tomorrow and I talk a little bit about I would have liked to see Scott Caldwell come in at halftime for Diego Fagundes because I don't think Diego Fagundes was necessarily playing that well. And Scott Caldwell is the type of guy who holds possession, does those quick passes. That said, you don't often see halftime subs. Like if you're thinking about making that change, you're probably not going to make it until like the 60th minute or so. And really what it comes down to is it kind of being an unfortunate situation where they let that goal, and that gives Orlando a little bit more momentum and a little bit more confidence to make things happen. So the entire game itself was played at a crazy pace. It was back and forth. Both teams had opportunities. Honestly, 3-3 is a pretty crazy scoreline to see in soccer in general, but it actually might have been a conservative scoreline. I mean, especially Matt Turner made what's becoming a weekend thing where every single weekend he's making these great saves. Same thing happened on Saturday. So it was just a wild affair. You hope that you can hold on to it if you're up 3-1 at halftime. But, that second goal for Orlando really changed things. And really, I'm not sure what they can do to avoid it.
Yeah, he made a lot of great points there. And honestly, the goals that were scored in this game, I would argue were not even the best chances of this game because I think Pinilla had a fantastic chance late where he probably should have scored. Orlando had some great chances where Matt Turner just came up huge. And some of the goals that were scored in this one had a much higher level of difficulty than the chances that were wasted. But, to me, what was really disappointing from the Revolution was the defensive play on set pieces. We've seen it a lot from the Revs over the years. You kind of hope Bruce Arena would fix it, and he's been here long enough where you kind of hope to be better. But it was a corner kick in which Orlando scored the first goal. Really, and wasn't even a great position for Nani. He was running away from goal on a fantastic header. But you'd like to see tighter marking on that. And then Dom Dwyer's goal that made it 3-2 really started with a throw-in. And he was kind of wide open in the box. It was a fantastic, again, Nani with a fantastic cross into the box, but he wasn't closed down fast enough, and then Dwyer was pretty open for that one. So that's something that's kind of troubling, isn't it, to see the Revolution at this stage of the game again, still kind of lackadaisical on these set pieces?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you can always put more pressure on those players, but again, Dom Dwyer's header just kind of that's a pretty amazing header to have scored there. Maybe if you put a little bit more pressure on him, he has a hard time doing that flick on header. But it was still something that to me came out of something that was pretty minor. So yeah, I mean, obviously when you look back, you always want to be better in those marking those opportunities. But I'm not sure if Dom Dwyer always scores that type of header when given that opportunity.
No, that's a fair point for sure. But you look at the Revolution's play now, and they've only had one win since July. It's kind of the gloss of the arena tenure kind of worn off a little bit. Obviously, they're still doing much better than they did under Brad Friedel, but it seemed like for a while there that Arena could do no harm. And you mentioned the Fagundes play in this game. I didn't think he was great either. And Scott Caldwell's a guy that really hasn't seen much time. I thought he played better tonight in his limited minutes. And he was a guy that I would have expected to start this game given the absences they had, especially on the road, where it's kind of aggressive, at least to me, to put Fagundes kind of in that number 8 role, isn't it?
Yeah, I was surprised by it. I mean, I think though it kind of tells you what Bruce Arena thinks of Scott Caldwell. I mean, he's mostly been the guy that comes in late in games and plays the last couple of minutes. This is actually a pretty long stretch for him to come in on the, I believe, 74th minute last night and to play 16 minutes to end the game. I was surprised, and I mentioned this before, that we've seen Juan Agudelo, we've seen Diego Fagundes play that role in the middle, but it's often against teams that are not the most aggressive in the middle or not the best offensives. So this was kind of a big challenge for Diego because it's a team that was against the wall. I mean, Orlando had to attack. They talked about it in the post game, saying that this was their final. Like they knew they had to go out there and get 3 points if they wanted to have any chance of making the playoffs. So they were going to send people forward at all times. And I think you really see at times that Diego Fagundes is not the best. It's not natural for him to defend per se. He's sometimes a little clunky. Sometimes he doesn't move his feet quick enough. And we saw that third goal of the night. Nani just had his number. I mean, he cuts one way, then he cuts the other way. Diego is just spinning in that situation, and Nani scores a great goal right there. And so to me, that's what I said earlier, that okay, if you want to start Diego Fagundes, that's fine. I mean, it worked out that they were 3-1 at halftime, but to me, it's also a little fortunate to be in that situation. So maybe you make a halftime sub, Brad Friedel style, and you bring on a guy that holds possession for you in Scott Caldwell. And hopefully you can see out that game a little bit more successfully, because he's a guy who knows how to protect the back line. He knows how to connect passes. He knows how to hold possession. That's what the Revs really needed to do, because the game was being played so quickly that you needed to slow it down a little bit by just connecting safe passes, making sure that Orlando didn't have the ball. And the Revs really didn't do that. Like, Orlando had a lot of good opportunities and a lot of they held the ball quite well, and the Revs kind of just try to stay behind the ball, and that's difficult to do for any extended amount of time, especially playing at a place that's very difficult, a place you've never won before, and it didn't work out. I mean, hindsight's 20/20. I mean, if you're talking about being up 3-1, do you make a halftime substitution? No, you usually don't. But when you look back and think about Diego being burnt on the third goal, and then the Revs giving up that second goal right after halftime, maybe you want to bring on a defensive midfielder, a more natural defensive midfielder at halftime to hold possession.
Yeah, certainly hindsight's 20/20, but looking back at it, that makes a lot of sense. My bigger surprise here was that they waited till the 68th minute to actually make a sub, given how poorly they started in the second half. It seemed a little bit slow to pull the trigger. And then I was kind of surprised that the substitution was Michael Mancian coming on for Juan Fernando Caicedo after this game had already kind of blown up and become 3-3 at that point. You mentioned Scott Caldwell. It seems like that was maybe a time to make that sub, Diego, for Scott Caldwell. You look at the chances that Orlando had right after they scored that equalizer. It kind of made an unmarked run through the midfield to get open, and led to a really good save from Matt Turner that really could have made it 4-3 there. And that was one of those plays where Diego was kind of caught ball watching and was a little bit slow to track the runner. So to me, that looked like that was the obvious first sub. What did you make of that first sub there with Mancian coming on for Juan Fernando Caicedo and really hunkering down defensively after they'd already blown the lead? Yeah,
I think that Bruce kind of saw that there were some issues going on, and he was hoping to bring on Mancian and allow Brandon Body to get forward a little bit more. I mean, that's kind of what he always does anyway, but maybe you provide a little bit more coverage for him in those opportunities. And it almost worked out. I mean, soon after Mancian comes in, Brandon Body gets really, really high, offers one of his low crosses, which are his best crosses versus the ones in the air. And Juan Fernando Caicedo almost able to poke that in. I mean, if that works, then you have a 4-3 lead and you have that center back to hold things down. So I can see the mindset behind it. You want to try to solidify things. Mancien has that experience. Honestly, though, I probably would have gone Jalil Anibaba. I mean, I just think that Mancien's good for one mistake per game or so, and he doesn't always track very well. He struggles sometimes with going 1v1 against someone and his clearances. Jalil Anibaba, however, is that kind of player who brings so much energy, and he's also really good at making those big blocks. So you imagine late in the game when things are pretty uneasy in the game that's going really fast, you want someone who's going to throw his body in any which direction to try to keep that ball at the back of the net. So, I mean, when you look at the sub options, Tajon, obviously, first of all, the Revs are down one sub because of injuries and suspensions. So you have less options on the bench. I mean, Tajon Buchanan is there, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that Bruce Arena is not going to bring on Buchanan. So Caldwell is another guy who hasn't really had a lot of opportunities under Arena. Teal Bumber is coming back from injury. So if you're trying to solidify things in that spine and give a little bit more freedom to Brandon Bai, I understand bringing in another center back. But yeah, it definitely, on paper, 100% seems weird because you're down. You're tied, and you just let up 2 goals, and now you're bringing on a center back. Seems a bit weird, but I think that it was just about bringing on some experience and trying to solidify things there.
Did you find it odd at all that the Revolution didn't have that 7th sub there, given that they had a lot of guys out on loan that could have come back in? Brian Wright's been playing pretty well, and it seemed like Bunbury, given how few minutes he played in this game, probably wasn't ready to go more than 6-10 minutes in this one. Was that surprising to you? And there were rumors or murmurings throughout the week that they would actually call somebody up to kind of fill out that bench.
Yeah, I mean, Brian Wright would have been an interesting person. He's done some good things down in Birmingham. Another one would be Anking. Anking's done some okay things down in the USL. He got his first professional assist a few weeks back. I think that the situation was that Bruce Arena doesn't really know those guys very well and hasn't seen a lot of those guys. So he's probably more comfortable saying that the guys that have been in Foxborough every week, those are going to be his guys that go into this game, and he doesn't necessarily want to disrupt the USL play of the other guys. But yeah, it does feel weird that you have some attacking options. Rennick's is another player that could come in and maybe play some minutes. But maybe just Bruce Arena says, you know what, these are my guys. This is what I'm going with. Teal Bunbury on the broadcast, they talked about maybe he's going to play 20 minutes, but the circumstances didn't necessarily allow that, and he's coming back from injury, so you want to be careful with him. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a weird situation when you look here and you're saying, okay, it's late in the season, we're pushing for a playoff spot, and we're going into this game with pretty limited attacking options. Would you have liked to see someone come in?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this was I talked about last week. It was one of those games where it would have been nice to have a guy like Brian right out there for if Caicedo got tired. I thought I agree with you that the substitution kind of needed at the point where they made the Mancien for Caicedo sub was a defensive one to kind of clog up the midfield. I kind of disagree with that being the sub. I think Anibaba would have more sense. To me, I would have made the Caldwell for Fagundes sub there and seen if that alone could have kind of locked things up in midfield. I don't really fully understand, and I know we've talked about this before about why Bruce Arena seems to think so lowly of Scott Caldwell as far as how he ranks players. And I thought Caldwell performed pretty well in this one. So that's just the sub that there's been a few games this year where I would have liked to have seen the Revolution bring Scott Caldwell out there to see what he could do to try to lock up the game. It just seems when you're in a 3-3 game. At that point, that you don't want to sacrifice that much offense at that situation. And yeah, you make a good point about Brandon Bai pushing forward, but to me that would have been the sub to make, bring on Caldwell for Fagundes first and seeing if that fixed things before you went further. Because 3 points would have been really helpful for the Revolution here. Obviously, this was more of a must not lose game than a must win for the Revolution, because Orlando was a team that really needed 3 points out of this to put pressure on the Revolution as one of those teams behind them. The draw was still enough for the Revolution to stay in 7th place and keep Orlando back and really just leave Chicago and Montreal as the bigger threats at this point. But I would have liked to seen the Revolution have somebody else on the bench, be that Brian Wright, Isaac King, Justin Rennick, somebody else to offer something up there, because it also seems like Bruce Arena doesn't have too much faith in Tajon Buchanan as a guy that can come off the bench and make a difference, because we really haven't seen him get off the bench much at all since Arena's taken over. So you could very well be right that Arena trusts the guys that he has in camp, but it just seemed like one of those games where it's kind of weird that you have all these guys out on loan and you don't recall one of them for one game to fill out that bench.
Yeah, and to your point, I thought Juan Fernando Caicedo was actually pretty good, especially in the first half, being a hold-up striker. It's something that you need sometimes, the guy that can play his back to goal, especially with, Bo is so creative, and you want him just to be floating around and finding those spaces. You don't want him to be that number 9 with his back to goal. He's just not necessarily that good at that role. So you get a guy who is limited in the sense that he's not great at running. He's not great. His movement's not always as sharp as you want it to be, but he's someone that knows how to play as a number 9, and then you can have someone play off of him. So he's probably not going to play a full 90 minutes. So if you bring on Brian Wright to be a hold-up striker for 15, 20 minutes, especially if that format was working, it makes a lot of sense. Because you imagine that if you take him off, there's not many options as that pure number 9. And I don't think Bunbury's that same style of number 9. He's more the high-energy striker that presses and does the best he can to be his back to goal. But I think his touches are a little bit sloppier than you would want from a number 9 in that role.
Yeah, I'm completely agreement with you there. It does seem like one of those games where you could have perhaps benefited from that. And I'm not sure that Brian Wright's ready to take on that role for the Revolution, but there have been promising signs from him in Birmingham, or at least to me would have made sense to bring him back up and get him in training this week for a little bit with the team and see what he could offer, given the shortness of depth on this team, because it wasn't even 100% clear that Bunbury was going to be ready for this game until later in the week. But with all that said, what can you take away from a game like this, given now that the Revolution do have just one win in their last 7 games and are starting to sort of limp towards the playoffs rather than be in fantastic form heading towards the playoffs like it looked like they would be a month ago?
Yeah, I think that's my biggest takeaway, is that I still think the Revs are going to make the playoffs. But if you make the playoffs and you're in bad form, it doesn't really mean much. And to be fair, this season really doesn't matter that much because things were so dire at the beginning of the year under Brad Friedel, and then the hero that is Mike Lapper comes in, and the turnaround starts to happen, especially under Bruce Arena. But being this close to the playoffs and having that good form and thinking, man, maybe something could happen here. Maybe there's some magic in this season. We've seen in past years Revs teams, find that good form towards the end of the season and right into a potential MLS Cup final, going to the MLS Cup final. And you wondered if there was some sort of magic in this season. But if this trend continues of picking up points, which is nice, but if that trend continues and they just limp into the playoffs, like you said, then I don't expect them to make much noise in the playoffs. And that'd be kind of disappointing given the form and given what's happening here. I mean, we all know that Bruce Arena and the Revs are building towards next year, but that form could be hard to capture sometimes. And the Revs had it, and it just seemed like there was this unbeatability about them, that something good was going to happen this year. And for you to lose that, and then or if you're thinking about next year, I mean, nothing's promised next year. We have no idea what this Revs team will do next year. You imagine that Bruce Arena is going to bring in some more of his own players, and hopefully things are going in that positive trend. But we've seen promise before and then it not turn around. So in a year that things could happen, you would want a little bit more, because next year nothing's promised, nothing's guaranteed.
Yeah, I agree with that. And really, when you look at the past several games, it's the last 3 that have been really disappointing, because I think if you go back to that LAFC game at home and best team in the league, it's not too disappointing to see the Revolution outplayed by them. It's kind of expected. You're excited with how the Revolution been playing at that point, but you still know that the quality of the Revolution is not there with LAFC, so that wasn't too much of a surprise. And then going on the road, getting draws at Seattle and New York, even if some of the ways those played out were disappointing, I think those are results that you're happy with, getting a point out of that. And then, of course, winning at home versus Chicago. But you get into these last 3 games, and that game against Toronto at home, where you were playing a Toronto team that was missing Altidore, was missing some other guys, and you left it till late and just were able to salvage a draw on that one. That kind of showed where you're at, especially against another team that's borderline playoff team in the East that you're kind of competing for playoff positioning. That kind of started to show the weaknesses of the Revs. And then the New York City FC game, you kind of write off because of the red card, and obviously disappointing that they didn't at least get a draw out of that one, given they had one so late. But then this game was particularly disappointing because Orlando, very mediocre team. They've shown signs this season, and to be 2 goals up against a team like Orlando and not be able to hold on it and get a victory, that's a kind of a blow to a Revolution team that had been gaining a lot of confidence under Bruce Arena. So I'm very curious to see how they turn things around next weekend against Real Salt Lake. I think that'll be a crucial game for the Revolution to get 3 points out of, both for results wise and for confidence wise going into that late stretch. But my main takeaway from this game is, similar to yours, and I leave this game and kind of this last 3 stretch of thinking the Revolution really are kind of who we thought they were, when Bruce Arena took over, and that's a team that is better than what Brad Friedel had shown, but as a team that still doesn't have the quality to actually compete for an MLS Cup. I think Bruce Arena's had them playing overall a lot better than the sum of their parts, and I also think there's more quality on this team than Brad Friedel had them playing with. But still, I think they went into having Bruce Arena as coach knowing that this team had a lot of weaknesses, and I think now it's become obvious that they do still have a lot of weaknesses, that there are some issues with that defense, that there are situations in which the attack doesn't finish well enough when they get in good positions. So yeah, they're a playoff team. I think they have the talent to be a playoff team, and certainly if they didn't have that terrible stretch with Brad Friedel, they'd probably be comfortably somewhere in the middle of that pack to make the playoffs. But these last 2 games have just shown me that there's still a lot more talent needed to actually get this team over the hump to be a contender.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you look at the teams that are nearby. You mentioned them earlier, Montreal and Chicago. I said this a few weeks ago. To me, the biggest threat going into these last few games was Chicago, and a lot of people were a little bit surprised when I said that. But their form is the best of all the teams below that 7th spot right now. I mean, at the time when I said it, they had some wins, some draws, and they were going into New England. Of course, New England won that game 2-1. So that was where I was like, you know what, they're now kind of safely in that zone. But since that game, they got a point against Columbus. They beat FC Dallas 4-0 because this is MLS. You never know what's going to happen. And they have games against Cincinnati. It's away at Cincinnati, Toronto FC, and Orlando. I mean, those are all winnable games. Toronto FC is going to be difficult, especially now their current form, and they're moving up the standings. But Cincinnati, even though they won this weekend, they're obviously a pretty poor team. They're a team that, that was the first one to be knocked out of the playoffs going through the coaching change. And Orlando is virtually out of the playoffs at this point. So you wonder at the end of the season, of course they want to play spoiler. Of course they want to win at home, but you wonder how much fight's going to be left in that team. So they're 3 points back. I still think New England holds on to that spot. But I think that, to me, Chicago is the biggest challenger because you look at the other one, you look at Montreal, and Montreal has to go to the Galaxy. They host Atlanta, and then they host the New York Red Bulls. That's a pretty daunting end to the season, especially when you're already on 2 losses. You have a coach that's come in that's supposed to turn this team around, but he clearly hasn't. So you wonder where exactly Montreal's head is as they enter this last stretch of the season.
Yeah, I agree with you, and this was a question that Paulo West had asked us as well, and I'm 100% agreeing with you that Chicago is the bigger threat to the Revolution. Obviously, the Revolution have a game in hand, so they're in the driver's seat here. But you look at that schedule, Cincinnati, all road games are tough, but Cincinnati has been a really poor team this year, and that's a game that's absolutely winnable for Chicago. Any home game is I consider a winnable game, even against a Toronto FC side that's playing a little bit better as of late. So I think that's a game that Chicago could potentially get 3 points out of. And then, you mentioned Orlando. Orlando is not eliminated yet, but by the final week of the season, there's a very good chance they will be eliminated, and there's a very good chance their elimination will come in week 33. So then they go into that last game, kind of disappointed that their season didn't pan out as hoped, and there's a potential there that they, maybe they're playing for spots and trying to impress, but there's also the potential that their season just got crushed the week before and they kind of roll over for Chicago on that one. So I 100% agree. Chicago is a team to worry about. Montreal is kind of limping down the stretch, and they have a very, very tough schedule to finish out the season at the Galaxy versus Atlanta and versus New York Red Bulls. They might drop all of those games. So if I'm the Revolution, the team that I'm scared about catching me is Chicago. I still think the Revolution are in a very good position. Given that, I don't think Montreal is going to have enough to catch them. I don't think Orlando's going to have enough to catch them. But Chicago is that kind of the curveball there where they've been playing a bit better as of late, even with the loss of the Revolution. So that'll be interesting to see. The other question that Paulo had along the same lines, maybe this is a good time to take that now, is who would be the best first round matchup for the Revolution, assuming they do make the playoffs?
Yeah, so it looks like the Revs are probably going to finish in seventh place, which means that they would likely play Philly. I think it's a fine matchup for them to have. I mean, Philly's a good team this year. I think they play good soccer, and I've long really respected Jim Curtin as a coach. I think that's a winnable game to go to Philadelphia. I mean, the Revs in Philadelphia have had some wild games in the past, and this is the playoffs, so you never know what's going to happen. I mean, I'd rather have that than go to Atlanta, which is probably the other possibility there. So, I mean, Philly, that's not a bad game to have. Maybe you get some fans that are able to travel down to the game and get some support there. The thing about the playoffs in general is that if you get in, you never know what's going to happen. So Philly would probably be a good opportunity, a good matchup for the Revs.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think realistically it's either Philadelphia or Atlanta at this point. There's a long shot for Toronto, but Atlanta has 2 games in hand on them, and Philly has 1 game in hand, and I also don't think that either of those teams are going to catch New York City FC. So assuming the Revolution end up in the 7th spot, I think Philadelphia is probably the best matchup for them. I think a 1-game playoff at Atlanta United is going to be extremely difficult. They're going to, be 70,000 potentially fans in that stadium cheering against the Revolution. And, even though they haven't been the same team this year that they were last year, they've shown signs of it, and the quality there is just so great. Philadelphia has also been a phenomenal home team this year, but if I'm the Revolution, I'm hoping that it's Philadelphia over Atlanta. And in some senses, it might be better if the Revolution finish 7th, if that means playing Philadelphia, versus finishing 6th, if that means playing Atlanta. So we'll see how that plays out. But I'm hoping it's Philadelphia, because I could actually make it to that game if it was going to be Philadelphia. So that'd be nice for me. But I also think is a better matchup for the Revolution, or one that I would give them more of a chance of winning than going to Atlanta. In any event, any matchup for the Revolution where they're traveling on the road for a 1-game playoff is going to be very, very difficult, and they're going to be heavy underdogs in that matchup. But Philly just feels to me as a more winnable game of those 2 possible options. So we got a few more questions on Twitter. Some of them relate back to this game, and some of them relate to going forward. I guess we'll jump back into the game quickly. And you touched on this one quickly, but David Sibilian wanted to know, was that 3rd goal Diego's fault, or is Nanny just that good?
Yeah, I think that you just want to be better if you're going to be defending. I mean, Nani's obviously very good. He's quality. And I couldn't help but think during this game, I thought he was just absolutely dominant. He's on the ball all the time. Orlando wanted to get the ball to him because they knew his quality was there. And even though it was so obvious that they were playing the game through him, he was still able to get in spots and hit crosses and put himself in the right zones with his movement, and just a quality player. And I couldn't help but think about how there was rumors that he might come to the Revs. And if he comes to the Revs, then maybe you don't get Carlos Heel, and maybe you don't get Bo. But that'd just be fun to see all those guys playing with each other, and just the quality of soccer would have been just pretty amazing. I highly doubt that if you get Nani, you get both of them, let alone just one of them. But it just made me kind of think a little bit about it. But going back to Diego Fagundes, I just don't think it's natural for him to defend. I mean, that's been a criticism throughout his career, that he likes to stay high, that he doesn't always want to come back and defend. And now you're putting him in the middle, where that's a big responsibility for him, that he has to track players, that he has to make sure that he's putting in hard tackles, that he's not, biting when someone's doing a move. I mean, I think that you if you're going to be a center midfielder in a situation like that, then you have to make sure that you stand your ground, that you don't bite too hard on any type of moves. And I think that, obviously Zahibo probably would have been the player that played that position. After him, it's probably Juan Agudelo. But given the circumstances, both those guys being out, you imagine that that's an opportunity for Caldwell to step in, whether it's from the start of the game or at halftime.
The tough thing on that goal, too, is it looked like the Revolution had it pretty well covered. Caicedo kind of had the right side there, and Fagundes didn't really need to commit the way that he did. I wonder if part of the problem there was lack of communication, and Fagundes obviously not comfortable or not that familiar with playing that role, so part of that's to be expected. But I don't know if part of that's just on Caicedo to yell at Fagundes there and say, hey, I got that side covered. You stay over there, because he was, Nani was pretty well covered on that play, and there just wasn't a need for Fagundes to commit. So that's got to be frustrating for Bruce Arena to see. But I also couldn't help but think when I saw that play that Scott Caldwell is probably a bit more comfortable in that position and a bit smarter about not committing on that play. So I don't know. I have trouble putting all that on Fagundes. It was a fantastic play. Some of that to me definitely falls on communication between him and Caicedo. But it's just a difficult way for the Revolution to blow a lead and end up with end up tying the game on that play. And on that note, we had a question from Cody Hall about why over the past 4 years do the Revolution consistently, and I won't use the expression here because we do not have an explicit rating on iTunes. I like to keep that, but why do the Revolution consistently fall apart between the 45th minute and 55th minute? And he questions whether it's culture, players, or perhaps coaching, even despite there being 3 different coaches in that stretch, and what can we do to fix it?
Yeah, it's a classic situation to kind of fall apart there. Again, what's weird about this one is that the Revs come out and it definitely looks like they're trying to be a little bit more compact as they're playing, and they're trying to make sure that they're not gonna they're conceding possession a little bit, I think, in the second half to try to make sure that it's not as easy to play through them. And yes, you want to mark Dom Dwyer a little bit tighter on that second goal, but that's just the header there. It's just a pretty amazing header to have happen. And like you mentioned,
and the placement of the cross too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one of those players that they're 2 quality players, but it's not like it's a through ball. It's not like some of the opportunities that we saw in the first half. It's just like a play where something magical happens, and it comes right after the break. It comes at the worst possible time, basically. The fans get into it. The Orlando starts to have a lot more energy. And then the next goal, like you said, the Revs are set up in a decent position, but Nani's a quality player that if you give him that little bit of space, he's gonna punish you. So to me, like that's not as a bad moment for the Revs as we've seen in the past. Like sometimes we just see them fall apart and it's like, silly defensive mistakes and it's just boneheaded moves. To me, like they were doing okay, but like these quality players do provide a little magic, and now the game's 3-3. And of course that's just disappointing because you're playing a team that is direct competition for a playoff spot, and you're already up 3-1. So, I mean, for me, it's a little bit of a tough one. It's a little bit different from some other ones that we've seen in the past because it happens so quickly, and there's not an absolutely glaring issue that you see there. Yes, you can mark a little bit tighter. Yes, you can be a little bit smarter, but the reality is that you're facing quality players that know how to step up and provide those moments of magic.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And to me, the more worrying play was actually some of the defensive errors they made after the game was tied 3-3, shortly after. I think early in the 60-something minute, where Kindle just made that run that nobody tracked and got open and had that volley on frame that Matt Turner saved. And there were a couple more breakdowns then. Those 2 goals, you can nitpick and say they could have defended them better in different ways, but a lot of that was just really quality players scoring really quality goals. And sometimes you just have to tip your hat to that. And maybe Fagundes should have done better. Yes, maybe somebody should have been tighter on Dom Dwyer, but it really didn't. It really seemed like the Revolution did a good job of kind of limiting the options there until that play opened up on Dwyer's in particular. So it's tough to say what the Revolution needs to do to fix that. You mentioned the Revolution kind of coming out more compact, and maybe that was the wrong move. Maybe the Revolution needed to stay more aggressive and try to add to their lead. I think the Revolution play better under Arena when they're kind of on the front foot than when they're trying to sit back and defend, and we have seen them blow several leads. I think they've this year, I don't know the breakdown between Arena and Friedel, but I think the stat now is that the Revolution have dropped 19 points from winning positions, which is obviously not great, and especially as you head towards the playoffs, not a good sign. But I don't really know what the Revolution can do differently to fix that, other than in particularly some better defending on set pieces and being more aggressive, challenging for headers, and obviously not letting the star player of the other team get that open for putting in a cross or getting an open header. But I do agree with you that a lot of that was just some great quality plays, and perhaps more disappointing that the Revolution couldn't have finished some of their chances. That Pania chance again sticks out late in the game where he had a great opportunity to finish. I think Gustavo Bo, if I remember correctly, also had a good chance late in the game that he probably wants back because the shot was too close to the goalkeeper. So this was just a weird game all around. And on that note, Randy LH asked, was this 2 points dropped because of the 2-goal lead in the first half, or a point salvaged considering how poorly we played in the second half? And we touched on that earlier. I think it was 2 points dropped because the Revolution kind of had this one in hand at halftime, and just the way they played in the second half. I think the Revolution showed they have more quality than that and are capable of beating a team like Orlando. So to me, this is 2 points dropped. Would you agree?
Yeah, totally. I mean, if you aren't sure about that, then take a look at the comments from Bruce Arena after the game. Poor Jeff Lemieux is trying to make it as positive as possible. Talk about, hey, you're still in a playoff spot. This is an important point. You're basically, knocking Orlando out. And every time Jeff tries to speak, Arena basically stops him mid-sentence and says, "Yeah, that we played bad. It was a game that we should have won." If you're up 3-1 at halftime, you got to see the game out in some ways. And like I said, it's difficult because those are great moments, but you go back and you figure out how can you make sure that you get 3 points in that situation.
Yeah, and another question, we talked about Caldwell a bit. Jason Schmidt wanted to know if he earned a seat back at the big boy table.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like you. I think that you were saying that you're surprised that he doesn't get more opportunities. I mean, remember, he signed a new contract this year, and granted, that's under Brad Friedel and that's under Mike Burns. But, this is a guy that people have talked about highly in the past. I mean, Jay Heaps famously said that if anyone was ever going to marry his hypothetical daughter, it was going to be a guy like Scott Caldwell. You heard Jermaine Jones used to say that he's a future U.S. men's national team player. And he's a guy that a lot of Revs fans have looked at and thought very highly of. And a game like today, you just imagine that he should have gotten more time than he did. But the fact that he didn't probably gives you some sort of idea of how Bruce Arena feels about him. I'll be interested to see what this offseason looks like. I think Bruce Arena is the type of coach that likes to do right by his players. We saw that Cody Cropper goes down to Hartford, and I think the reason why is because he knows that he needs games, that he knows that he's not in a situation where he's going to get a lot of opportunities for the Revolution. So why not get him some reps and make people aware that he's a player that could step in for you and do a decent job. Gabriel Somi was a guy that got cut and got sent away because they knew he wasn't going to make any minutes there. And there was talk that he could be released by the Revs now as a possibility to make a move to Sweden. That hasn't worked out for him. Apparently he's still without a job. We saw the loans for the homegrown guys to lower divisions. So I think Bruce Arena wants to do what's best for the players on the team. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Scott Caldwell because he is under contract, but if he's not going to be a regular contributor, maybe somebody else in the league wants to pick him up and give him a little bit more minutes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation because, as you mentioned, he did sign that new multi-year deal right before Bruce Arena took over. And, Arena's a guy that, given the situation, if he was to move on from Caldwell and try to trade him or something, I don't think, you couldn't blame Arena because he wasn't the one that had him sign that new contract. So there's certainly that factoring in. But it's surprising to me that he's fallen so far off the radar kind of for Arena, where it took, injuries and suspensions to guys like Agudelo and Zahibo to even get Caldwell the level of minutes he had in this game. And even then it was, Fagundes that was kind of filling into the 8th spot before Caldwell, because I do think Caldwell's a player that has some qualities that can help this team. I don't think he's a guy that's going to win you a championship. And I don't think he's a guy that can be, your number 6 that kind of dominates and takes over games on his own. He's not going to be a Jermaine Jones. He's not going to be a Shari Joseph, but he's a good complementary player that, generally is pretty safe with the ball in possession. There's been some moments a couple years ago, I think, that people kind of changed their view on that, where he had a couple bad giveaways, but generally I think he's a guy that does very well keeping the ball in possession and making sure the Revolution don't commit dumb turnovers, which it seemed like something they could have used earlier in this game. So I don't know. I think he played well. I think he potentially earned himself more minutes, but with all that said, the Revolution have Zahibo and Agudelo coming back next weekend, and I don't think he did enough to earn minutes over either of the two of them. So, even if he did play well and maybe he moved himself above Fagundes next time they need an 8 fill in, he might still be, number 3 on that chart right now. So I don't know what's going to happen there. It's just quite the change of events for a guy when the Revolution re-signed a few months ago. You could talk about him and Andrew Farrell being two guys that could potentially become the all-time leader in Revolution minutes. But now it looks more likely that he's going to go somewhere else or not be a part of this team than get that honor for the Revolution. So it's very interesting, and I'm curious to see how it plays out. But I don't think his play this week, as good as I thought it was, is going to be enough to move him above Zahibo or Agudelo for that role. So 4 games left of the regular season, certainly something to watch. But if he doesn't get more playing time, I think you could be right that we might see the Revolution move on from him in the offseason, which is just crazy to think given that new contract he got.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, yeah, it'll be, again, offseason will be really interesting to see what happens. Fagun is another player that we don't know what his future is, and there was rumors that he was going to leave at the end of last season. I mean, that's coming from his dad, and his dad is someone who tweets things like that pretty frequently without necessarily always following through. So, yeah, I mean, we've said multiple times, and Bruce Arena said it, that the rest of this season is a setup for next season. So we'll see what happens in the offseason.
So we talked about this before a bit with the 45th to 55th minute question, but we had a couple of similar questions here. Justice for Tony asked, why are the Revolution so good at blowing leads? And Mike D asked, what can be done with the current team to stop us from these meltdowns that cost us wins? And is it just as simple as we can't win these games with this roster? We talked about this before. I don't think it's just as simple as that the Revolution can't win those games with this roster. You can't tell me that the Revolution don't have enough talent to hold on to a 2-goal lead against Orlando. I think we talked a bit about some of the things they could have done. And to me, some of that goes back to, when you're in a situation like this and the game's getting away from you, why don't you bring on a guy like Scott Caldwell that can kind of calm the game down a bit. I don't know if you have any other thoughts since you kind of touched on this, but I don't think it's, there is a talent issue, but I don't think there's a talent issue where the Revolution don't have enough talent to hold on to a 2-goal lead against a team like Orlando.
Yeah, and we've mentioned it multiple times. I just think it's about holding possession a little bit more and taking the wind out of Orlando. I mean, that goal comes at the worst possible time because they score, they get absolutely hyped, and now the Revs are playing a little more defense than they want to play, and Orlando's coming at them with numbers. Especially this time of the season when they know their back's against the wall. So I think on a different night, when that first goal isn't scored and they hold the ball a little bit more, the Revs are able to see that game out. But credit to Orlando for coming out there and pushing the Revs and getting that goal and then getting themselves back in the game.
We got 3 more questions. These ones are all from Revolution Report. The first one's an interesting one. And he asks, is Juan Caicedo worth keeping next season? I know he's old and expensive, but he has definitely contributed this season. What are your thoughts on Juan Caicedo? Obviously, he's a guy that's on loan, so it would require them picking up a transfer fee that we have no idea what that would actually be at this point.
Yeah, he's not worth keeping around next year. And that's coming from me, who's been the biggest defender of Juan Fernando Caicedo. I kind of made that my big hill that I was going to die on this year because I think he has the qualities of a number 9. He's a different type of striker than Bunbury is. Bunbury presses everywhere he goes. He works really hard. But I think Caicedo has that little bit of quality that you want from a guy up top. I mean, he loves the little back heels. He loves the little runs in the box to try to finish things off. He likes to combine with other players. And he has an okay touch at times. But he's just not fast enough. He's just not sharp enough. I mean, the fact that he hasn't played 90 minutes very often, or even, minutes beyond like the 75th minute, kind of tells you that he just hasn't really assimilated as well as you'd hope in MLS. I mean, I think he has 5 goals in the season, which is great for us considering our bet that we made with Greg at the beginning of the year. But I just think that he's probably, if you're going to bring him in, he's probably going to command a pretty big salary. I imagine that Bruce Arena probably already has some targets in mind that could play that number 9 role, and maybe you use Teal Bunbury to come in later, or maybe Teal Bunbury plays on the wing. But I just think that he's a serviceable player. He's fine for what he's on the roster, so you might as well use him. But I just don't think that he's the future of the Revs. He's an older player. I mean, he's not lighting the league on fire. You look at for Brian Fernandez over in Portland. He comes in as a number 9, and he's a full-on finisher, similar to what you'd hope Caicedo could be. And Fernandez has just lit the league on fire. He's been excellent in that number 9 role. Fernandez isn't good at other things, but he really finishes all the time. And Caicedo doesn't do that. I mean, Caicedo plays his back to goal. He finishes here or there, but that sharpness and that quickness just isn't there overall to bring him in for another year.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, he's been decent enough for the Revolution this season. 5 goals isn't a terrible haul. It's also interesting to note that those 5 goals have come in as 11 starts and 13 appearances off the bench. He has 0 goals. So he hasn't really been someone that's had too much of an impact off the bench. He's worked better as a starter. And 5 goals and 11 starts isn't that bad. But, we don't know what that transfer fee is, if it's, perhaps much cheaper than you would expect, or if it's, usually when there's that transfer fee, there also is a, guaranteed contract that comes in with it. And we don't know what that would be either. Certainly if he's even a TAM player, I'd say that would be too much. The only way, if I was the Revolution, I would keep him is if, for some reason he's not a TAM player and his transfer fee is really low, which would also, factor into being a TAM player. But I think the Revolution can do better than him as a number 9. I think the Revolution needs to do better than him as a number 9 next season. And Bruce Arena is capable of finding somebody, I would think. He is 30 years old. He'll turn 31 in the middle of next season. That's not too old for a striker. But there's good things about his play. He's a good finisher, but his weird style of running and his some of the limitations of his game just make me think the Revolution kind of need to do better than him next season when it comes to finding a number 9 and a guy that can play with Gustavo Bowen and Carles Heel and combine with those guys. So it's something to watch for and interesting to see what the Revolution do. But my bet is that the Revolution don't bring him back unless the transfer fee is crazily low and the contract he would get is crazily low, and I don't expect that to be the case. And with that said, the next question was, what is the biggest position of need for the Revolution? And that might kind of play into what we just talked about with the number 9 role.
Yeah, I still think it's defensive midfield. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Luis Caicedo. I think he's just an absolute bulldog. He has Brad Friedel called him very similar and said that he was very similar to Diego Chara, and I see that week in and week out. That guy just works so hard in the middle of the park. He makes mistakes time to time, but generally speaking, he's doing the right things there. I think you need someone to pair with him. Zahibo has been better under Bruce Arena. I think that it's been clear that, Caicedo and Zahibo have been told what their roles are, and their roles have been more defined, where it's not just about like pressing as high as you can and working everywhere on the ball and putting all that effort in. Now it's about, okay, just protect the back line. Here's the positions that you're going to be in. You don't have to press everywhere on the field. Just be smart about blocking passing lanes so that we can let the attacking players be attacking players. So I think that Zahibo's been better, but to me, he's still not the bulldog in the middle that you really want. I mean, if you can find someone to pair with Caicedo, I think your defense will be better. I think that your ability to attack will be better, especially if that player can hit that diagonal ball to make the other opponent uneasy in those situations. So I think that's probably a higher one in my opinion. The other one is center back. I mean, that's a really big question because I'm a big fan of Delamea, but he's injury prone. He gets a lot of cards. He got another yellow card in this game. I just don't know if you're going to see him back again. Even if you do see him back, you probably want to bring in a little bit more competition, especially because Andrew Farrell's been excellent there. I mean, that might be his future. I even asked Bruce Arena at one point, is he a center back now? And Bruce says he is now because he has to be. I don't know what his future will be. But you imagine that Andrew Farrell maybe moves back to that right back's position where he's been solid for many years, even though he can't necessarily cross that well. I mean, the outside backs are a huge concern as well. I think that if you talk to any Reds fans, they're not really happy with Castillo. And DeJuan Jones was exploited against NYCFC, and it's just clear at times that he's a rookie that's just really fast. And maybe he can grow into that position, but I just can't imagine the future of the Revs being DeJuan Jones at the left back and at the right back position, Brandon Bai. I mean, both have their limitations. So those are positions that you're probably going to want to upgrade. Obviously, number 9 is another spot, but I think that I don't want to go into another season where I see Teal Bumber as a starting number 9, but I think if you upgrade some other positions before that striker position, it's not the worst thing in the world. But I think ideally, you're looking to bring in reinforcements at all of those spots. So you're looking at 3 or 4 spots that you're hopefully upgrading ahead of next year.
Yeah, and I'd like to disagree with you because I think we're agreeing too much on this episode. But I really would echo everything you just said, except the only thing I would add is that it might actually be 4 or 5 spots I would say the Revolution need to try to upgrade next season. And I think that's kind of part of the takeaway of these last few games is, going back to when the Revolution were doing really, really well under Bruce Arena, and it seemed like they were unbeatable. There was some question maybe the Revolution actually don't need that many changes in the offseason, and even Bruce Arena said that, kind of said something along the lines that the roster is better than he thought it was. But I still think they do need 4 or 5 upgrades in this offseason. And I would agree that the defensive midfield, central midfield role, that's somewhere where they could really upgrade and could have the most influence with somebody in that position. You certainly saw what Jermaine Jones did. You certainly could see in the past what Shari Joseph added to this team, and when he disappeared, how much they lost there up until they got Jermaine Jones. So that's a position to me where they could have the most influence with bringing somebody in. But I agree that the fullback spots really need an upgrade. I even thought in this game where Jones was okay, his passing percentage was really high, but there were definite times in this game where it was noticeable to me that his inexperience kind of left him in not knowing where to be positioned as a left back and kind of not reading the game correctly as a left back. And it's to be expected for a rookie that's learning a new position. And maybe during the offseason he can learn it better, or maybe during these last 4 games he can learn it better. But I think both him and Brandon By, and maybe DeJuan Jones will be the future left back, and maybe I'm wrong there, but I think the Revolution could use upgrades from both of them. I think they could use another center back, and I definitely think they could use an upgrade at number 9 as well. So I think we're in agreement there, and I do think we're going to see pretty significant changes from Bruce Arena in the offseason, where we might actually see 5 new starters come next year. So it'll definitely be a fascinating offseason for sure, especially to see, whether the Crafts are willing to open up the purse strings to allow them to bring in even a third designated player of the caliber of a Carles Heel or Gustavo Bo, because that could make a huge difference for the team. And then the last question we had here was also from Revolution Report. What would you grade the season if the Revolution missed the playoffs?
If it missed the playoffs, I don't know. This is such a hard season to grade because they were so bad at the beginning of the year, and then they got much better under Bruce Arena and Mike Lapper. Let's give Mike Lapper a little credit here. And now they've kind of hit that downturn again. They're picking up points, which I think is a big positive. I think in past years, a lot of these games end up being losses, whether it's because they're picking up points because they were in a lead and they dropped some goals, or because they kind of got some big moments towards the end of the game. If they don't make the playoffs, I don't know, you're probably looking at a C or so, because it's about the future, right? And if you're a Revolution fan, you're probably pretty optimistic about the future, giving Bruce Arena, the training center that's open, Heel being here. And then after that, Bo being another big sign to say, like, no, we're going to continue to upgrade this team. Obviously, too, there's continual chatter about the stadium. I think it's pretty fascinating that you keep hearing Bruce Arena say, one day we hope to get a stadium, and talking about how good this team will be when we have a stadium. I'm not going to hold my breath and say that it's on the horizon, given like all the different times that we heard news in the past, and it's coming soon. But it is interesting that you hear that more often these days. So I don't know, a C. If they don't make the playoffs, I think that's a huge negative for them, because they had the ability to make the playoffs. So if they make the playoffs, I'm probably looking at a B or so. But because you're saying that if they don't make the playoffs, maybe I reduce that to a C, because there's that there's optimism about what this team looks like next year.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. You look at the schedule the Revolution have left, and I think that could kind of play a role in it too. I think even with the results recently, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic for next season. But you look at how the Revolution finished the season versus Real Salt Lake at home, and then away on the road at Portland, versus New York City at home, and then at Atlanta. So hypothetically, if the Revolution missed the playoffs but still don't do terribly down the stretch, let's say they beat Salt Lake, lost to Portland on the road, which wouldn't be shocking at all, tied New York City FC at home, and then lost to Atlanta on the road, you wouldn't look at those results as incredibly disappointing or shock upsets in any way. I think that's kind of how you look at those games and expect them to play out if you're a betting man. And that might not be enough if Chicago does really well on the stretch. So hypothetically, if that's what were to happen, I think you could still give the Revolution perhaps a B minus, factoring in how Arena was able to turn this team around for the most part, how poorly they did under Friedel, and also just the fact that there is reason for optimism because they do have Carles Heel now, who is one of those guys who can help build the team around. They do have Gustavo Bo, who's a guy that can be a key contributor to this team for at least another couple of years. They do have Matt Turner, who's been playing incredibly well, who now looks like the long-term keeper of the future for the Revolution, who they signed up to a long-term contract. And then there's the training facility that's supposed to open, I think, in the next 30 days, I think it was recently said. There's been even more murmurings that the Revolution got a USL2 team next year. It sounds like that's probably going to happen. Or USL Championship. What is it? USL League One, right? That's the second division of USL now.
Correct.
It sounds like that's probably going to happen. There's just a lot of reasons to be positive. Now, if the Revolution lost their last 4 games of the season, that would put more of a damper on things, and I think you're probably looking at more of a CC minus. But if they just play decently well as you'd expect down the stretch and maybe pick up 1 win and a draw and then lose the other 2 games and miss out because Chicago goes on a great run, I could still see them giving them a B minus, given where things were, back at week 12 of the year. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. But before we wrap things up, we didn't talk about the USL team. What would that mean for the franchise if that does happen? Because we heard rumors about it a while ago, and now we're hearing more rumors that it could happen as soon as next season. Supposedly there's going to be 3 new teams in the league next year, and one of them, according to sources, I forget who forced reported this. I'll try to figure that out unless you know what we're talking about it. But what would that mean for the Revolution to finally have a USL team of their own?
Yeah, I think it'd be huge for them. They've long struggled with developing some of those players, and promising guys have kind of just been hanging on the bench without getting many minutes, waiting for the U.S. Open Cup, which is just and then they get there, and sometimes these younger players haven't played, they jump into these games, and sometimes they're being asked to play out of position because there's not enough players to fill out a roster. So the Revs got better at that this year with Birmingham and sending 2 players there, Zach Harivo and Brian Wright. That said, I'm not sure how much of a future either of those guys have with the Revolution. So to me, I think they just sent them there to say, go get some minutes, put yourself in the shop window, think about what your next step might be. I think the bigger ones are looking at Renix and Anking because they weren't really doing anything this year, but they're homegrown players with potential. So I think those guys need minutes. That's the long and the short of it, is that they need professional minutes, and that's what an affiliation is supposed to do. And it didn't work with Rochester because they felt so disconnected with the team. I talked to players that went to Rochester, and they were like, dude, we just felt like we were on an island. Like, nobody cared about us. Nobody was really checking in with us that often. So that kind of came to an end. We saw some short term, week to week. So you train with the team, and then you go out somewhere for a game. To me, I can't imagine that's that helpful because you don't really know the tactics per se of that team. So unless you're going in there and you're clearly head and shoulders above the players that are already there, you're probably not necessarily have the chemistry to do well in those positions. So I don't think that was ever going to be a long-term fix. So what we have right now is okay, but there's still a situation where you're not training with the first team. So Bruce Arena is probably getting feedback from teams, especially because you think about it, Renix is down there with Dave Sarakin, and obviously Dave Sarakin and Bruce Arena know each other really well. So I'm sure they're keeping in contact about how Renix is doing on a week-to-week basis. But I still don't think it's an ideal situation. I think ideally you have those guys train nearby. They train with their USL team, but they're able to jump into sessions with the Revolution, or Bruce Arena is able to go to the USL team and to take a look at how they're training and how they're doing and think about possible call-ups. I mean, you look at the best example of this is the Red Bulls, right? I mean, the Red Bulls have done an excellent job of getting guys opportunities from Red Bulls 2 to play with the first team. So I think it'd be huge for the Revs to have their own team. I think there was a lot of hope that Hartford would be that. I mean, I think that the situation that Cody Cropper in is pretty decent. I mean, it's different because he's a goalkeeper and you don't have to train with your team in order to do well. You kind of just stand between the sticks and make the saves and do those types of, step up for the big moments. But I think that there was hope that Revs players would be playing for Hartford. We did see a couple players, young players, show up on the bench there, but they didn't get any minutes. They didn't play. I'm not exactly sure what happened in that situation. But I mean, look at Firmino. Like, what's his deal? Where does he stand in the pecking order as far as this team? So I think that having a USL team is a step in the positive direction. I just wish that some of this stuff came sooner. It just feels like the Revs are sometimes reactionary, and there is a positive to that because you don't want to spend a lot of money when you don't fully know if the system's going to work or if it's going to be the right fit for the league. I mean, you look at Montreal, and Montreal shut down their USL team, So it's okay to kind of wait for something to make sure it's kind of perfection. But for the Revs, I think that they could have done this a little bit sooner and already started to get some of those academy players pushing towards the first team.
Yeah, and just to give the credits to the original story, it was Colton Qureshi who had the latest story that said the Revolution would be joining USL League One next year. So that would be a huge thing. I agree with everything you said. One guy that I talked about with Greg last week was Tajon Buchanan, who hasn't been getting minutes. I think it would be huge for a guy like that who's 20 years old to continue to be able to train with the first team with the Revolution and get that experience, but then also actually get playing time. And it's difficult for a guy like that you want to be developing yourself if you're Bruce Arena. And even a guy like Justin Rennicks who has gone out on loan, guys like that you'd like to see training with the first team, have the opportunity to still go out and get those minutes on weekends. So I think it would be of huge help for the Revolution, especially considering, when you look at the Revolution's depth right now and how they have so many young players that are kind of those secondary strikers or winger type players that just aren't getting minutes because of, who's ahead of them, because of guys like Pania, because of guys like Bo and Hurley's heel and, even Fagundes. When he's out there, that those guys aren't getting minutes. It would be so much better for the Revolution to be able to keep those guys training with the first teams, but then still get them game minutes with a USL One team. And you mentioned the Red Bulls as a team that has done very well at bringing guys up, and they certainly have. I just picture the Revolution not too many years ago when they would go into an Open Cup game where they'd have guys like Donnie Smith playing center back because they were just didn't want to play first team players and were forced to play guys so out of position that nobody really benefited from that. So you get that USL team, and that's kind of the end of the stupidity of seeing stuff like that. And even with the Revolution this year and how thin they've been at center back, I think it would be very helpful for the Revolution to have had extra pieces down there that they could have called up and brought in when they needed extra pieces on the bench. So I agree. It's overdue for the Revolution, but it would be huge if the Bruce Arena era started off with the new training facility, and all of that just adds to stuff to look forward to for the Revolution next season.
Yeah, certainly. And I think you actually missed a question. At Carl Sutherland, who I believe is a big Revolution fan, I think he's a guy that's constantly in the stands. He asked, should Diego be the team captain?
Yeah, I'm gonna go no on that. I know Carl's a huge Diego Fagundes fan, but I think you got to be a regular starter to be the captain, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think I see him oftentimes wearing Diego Fagundes jerseys, waiting outside Gillette Stadium for autographs. So I totally understand, wanting to put a pitch out there for someone who you really enjoy, really like supporting. But yeah, I think you have to be a starter to be a captain. But thanks for the question, Carl. Really appreciate it.
I always appreciate questions from Carl. So, and before we wrap things up, the Revolution, as we mentioned, have 4 big games coming up to decide whether or not they make the playoffs. Do you think we see any major lineup changes against Salt Lake?
Yeah, I imagine Zahibo comes back into the fold. I like to see Juan Fernando Caicedo stay up top because I think he's just a better number 9. Like you said, he does a better job starting, and then you could give Teal Bunbury a little bit more rest. One guy we didn't mention, I thought Pania had an excellent game. Obviously, the goal was stellar, was world class. But I think beyond that, I thought there was a lot of energy from him. I mean, he needs to do better on those 2 opportunities in the second half. The shots are basically right at the goalkeeper. But I thought that he was doing all the stuff you'd want him to do. So I think that he'll continue to start out there. I think in the back line, you're probably looking at that same back line. Zahibo is probably the biggest one that I'm thinking off the top of my head that comes into the lineup.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it was actually surprising if you looked on Twitter, there were a few people that were pretty negative on Panini after this game because I thought he had a decent game as well. He was also involved in Gustavo Bo's goal in the build up there, and his goal was obviously fantastic. Certainly you can knock him for not having better finishing late in the game, but I think he's earned another start for the Revolution. I, like you, suspect that the change that we're going to see is Zahibo coming in for Fagundes, but otherwise I think we're going to see a pretty similar lineup. I'd be surprised if Bunbury is ready to start and go 90 minutes, but maybe that's another change for Caicedo. But other than that, I think we'll probably see the same lineup from the Revolution and Bruce Arena that we saw this week. And before we wrap things up, do you want to give out your Twitter handle and let people know where they can find your writing?
Yeah, at SethMan31. I write for the Bent Musket. I'll have a Three Thoughts piece coming out tomorrow, which is pretty similar to what you just heard, but maybe you want to read it instead of hearing my voice.
Thanks, Seth. And you can follow me at Sean L. Donahue, and of course, follow us at Revolution Recap. And we should be back again next week. Thanks for listening.